Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Reality of Net Zero seminar series. This is a seminar series hosted by the Oxford Net Zero Research Group, and we're exploring why we need net zero, the progress that we've made and not made, and how we can achieve net zero in a fair and sustainable way. This is hosted by Oxford Net Zero, the Zero Institute, and Oxford Earth Sciences. It's 8 weeks long in total, and we have a little graph that will show how far through we are in the series if this is the first time you're tuning in. So what we have today is a presentation from the engagement and impact team, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. So you can see that there's a Q&A box that you can use to ask questions and upvote questions that you'd like to hear the answers to. I'm Alexis McGivern. I'm the head of stakeholder engagement at Oxford Net Zero, and I'm delighted to be here with my team today, Matilda Becker and Kaya Axelson. I'll hand over to them to introduce themselves before diving into the webinar.
Hi everybody, my name is Matilda and I work with Alexis and Kaya as the Strategics Partnership Manager. I'm also a research fellow and at the moment my work is specifically related to equity and justice in the net zero standards.
Hi everyone, I'm Kaya Axelson. I work very hard with the team on net zero standards, which you'll hear a lot about today, and policy and practice. So we get to cover it all, and we're so excited to share the progress that we've seen in the net zero translation space.
Amazing. So as we mentioned, this is part of a seminar series, and we had started with another webinar that we had earlier a few weeks ago, which was myself and Professor Miles Allen speaking about where removals sit in the standard space and the need for removals to reach net zero. We had our colleagues Lavanya Rajamani and Ewan White do a seminar on the role of international law in net zero. And if you tuned in last week, you heard about net zero carbon energy systems from our colleague, Dr. Nick Eyre. So we're here today to talk about the translation of net zero from this global concept into policy and practice, as Kaya just mentioned. And just to note, we're in a network of around 40 academics sitting within the University of Oxford across 11 departments. So within our ranks, we have biologists, anthropologists, physicists, earth scientists, lawyers, and we're all coming together to share our insights over the seminar series. So do make sure to head to netzeroclimate.org and check out where the other seminars will happen this month and next. So next slide, please. So over the next sort of 30 minutes or so, we're going to be setting the scene, speaking about the role of standards in translating global net zero into practice and some recent trends that have come through in this space. And then we're going to sort of do a mini deep dive into 3 key areas that are under debate in the standards. So that's scope 3, a discussion over market-based mechanisms and where equity and justice fits into the net zero standards landscape. So each of us will be giving you a little sort of potted summary of what's happening in the standards at the moment and how we're trying to translate global net zero into guidance for corporations or other non-state actors. And then we'll walk on to what's next. So what's next for us in terms of our team and where do we think standards are moving down the line, especially noting that 2025 and 2026 is a really pivotal year for standards. So with that, I'll hand over in the capable hands of the brilliant Kaya Axelson to walk you through the role of standards in getting us to net zero.
Thanks so much, Alexis. And it strikes me that this picture we've chosen for the filler slide is a good example of what the standards landscape feels like sometimes. You have these kind of dips and troughs and then these peaks where we have standards coming out and innovating and multiple standards converging together to make a beautiful but complex landscape, increasingly converging, but not without its challenges, especially as corporations and users feedback their implementation challenges and opportunities and where they see the opportunity for the most action. So as a research team, we have the privilege of sort of sitting between all those stakeholders and actors and trying to translate not only what we see in the insights from their practitioners into standards, but also what the scientists are telling us as to what we need, the increasing urgency and the integrity challenges and opportunities. We love that work. So we'll tell you a little bit about that in detail today. Just to give an overview of sort of where we've come from and what we've responded to, in about 2021, there was an explosion of net zero progress and standards, and equally an explosion of headlines kind of challenging whether these net zero commitments were real, questioning the ways in which a net zero pathway could be gamed or the ways in which a net zero pathway could develop issues over time. And during that period, there was an initial push to develop some minimum criteria. I like to, when I'm public speaking, give a chance for people to have a simple acronym to remember what makes a good kind of net zero strategy and how you might score a net zero strategy along the various questions that come up regularly. You can follow the acronym SCORE. Does it have a short-term plan or target? Does it have good coverage across all greenhouse gases and scopes? Is offsetting used scarcely and with conditions to acknowledge the integrity challenges in the voluntary carbon market? Are there reporting opportunities and challenges? Is there true accountability? And has equity been considered for workers, communities, and the global impacts of a corporate transition plan? And out of that kind of packed acronym, there are, I think, over 400 indicators that we typically map across the net zero guidance landscape. And we'll get into a couple of those for you today. But it's been incredible to see the net zero standards and policy landscape, we'll talk about policy as well today, grow up from these headlines in, COP26, when net zero was really in question about what it all meant. And now there are a lot fewer questions. So we're excited to share where there's areas of convergence and ongoing debate today. There's a kind of wider landscape out there of standards and certifications that I think it's important to keep in mind. And when we study standards, we think about what we can learn not just from the net zero landscape, but also from comparable projects. So fair trade, what can we learn about the proliferation of that standard, how it's evolved and matured, the kind of simple technology standards that we need to make sure that consumers are not kind of having to buy a new laptop or a new charger every time that they have new technology. Standards are in almost everything that we use and we buy. And so why wouldn't a net zero standard apply to both products and corporations? This is something that I think people fail to recognize when they think about power in the world, is that there's this sort of invisible process. And a lot of that happens through the International Standard Organization or other like initiatives that work between researchers, practitioners, and governance in order to develop a higher quality infrastructure for all of our better usage. In particular, we have worked on the net zero guidelines for, as we mentioned, corporates and non-state actors. The top sort of 4 documents that have emerged since that period in 2021 are the SBTi net zero standard, which has had a lot of attention in the press recently and is going through an update. The UN has also weighed in with some high-level kind of comments on the commitments of non-state actors across a range of non-state actors. We've developed with international experts around the world, the net zero guidelines, and kind of before all of that was coming together, the Race to Zero did an important job of orchestrating convergence on minimum criteria. So that's just a reminder of where to look. If you're like, you keep talking about standards, but what actually are they? These are the documents that you can refer to and trawl through in depth.
Thanks, Kaya. And so we've included this slide basically to demonstrate how standards don't just develop out of a vacuum. They're sort of based on a larger body of voluntary initiatives or orchestration campaigns in which you gradually see the development of these norms, these best practices that are embedded within the standards, moving from very experimental and flexible, often very kind of boundary pushing, and then they kind of move along, so from left to right along the screen, to become more sort of solidified and more enforceable and more binding. And so what you see on the very left is in the voluntary initiatives, you might see some things that are really, really ambitious, but it's actually really hard to hold companies or non-state actors accountable to them. And of course, as you move from left to right, from standards and then ideally into regulation, it becomes much more binding and enforceable, but they also become much more difficult to change and amend, and that process can take sometimes several years. So we're really interested in this whole process because with standards, we're playing the long game really, so that it goes beyond political cycles. And I think that's something really hopeful that we should be bearing in mind at the moment, that the work that we're doing in this space does last, and there's also real momentum behind it. So we want to dig in a little bit into what the standards are actually starting to tell us about, or when I say us, what standards are starting to tell organizations what they should be doing to reach net zero. And so this is basically a summary of some of the high level areas in which standards converge from some analysis that we did of nearly 40 different standards that were sector agnostic last year. And we found some really promising things. For example, that targets should aim for 2050 at the latest, that organizations have to quantify and set targets for their scope 3 emissions. There's also very clear rules about how offsets should be used for their residual emissions at 2050, not for within their own inventories. And also other things that maybe don't immediately come to mind if you're thinking about net zero. For example, sort of organizational accountability, like linking executive pay to meeting climate targets and KPIs, shifting products and services towards climate solutions, and also the kind of lobbying and engagement that organizations are involved with. Are they setting ambitious net zero targets, but also, backing fossil fuel expansion or going against green policies in their lobbying spaces? But there's also, unfortunately, a lot of devil in the detail. And so even though there's quite a lot of guidance about what organizations should be doing, the how is not necessarily as well defined. And so if you're having to set, well, Alexa's going to talk more about this in a minute, but for example, with scope 3 emissions, you know that you should quantify and set a target, but how should you do that? There's a lot of different methods, a lot of different data and metrics and modeling that you could use to do that. But everything from how you're setting your scope 3 targets to the kind of baseline years that you're doing. So if you're comparing your emissions in 2022 to something in 2015, or is it 2020, that will really affect the kind of progress that you seem to be having. And we also see big gaps around impacts for biodiversity and nature. That's often quite sort of disaggregated from the net zero standards landscape, that they're sort of treated as two different objects, even though they're obviously very interlinked. And we're also seeing some gaps with regards to sort of equity and climate justice. That's something that companies are supposed to think about, but what the thinking actually means in practice is up for them to decide very often. And so what we'll do now is we'll dig into some of those challenges in a bit of a deep dive. So I'll pass back to Alexis.
Great, thank you so much. So as you mentioned, we'll dive into these three areas. Firstly, starting with discussion around scope 3. So if we can just click to the next slide, please. Thanks so much. So just as a very brief summary at the top for those who might not be familiar with the scopes framework, this was defined by the greenhouse gas protocols back more than 20 years ago, but it's essentially the level of control or ownership you have over an emission. So scope 1 being emissions that are directly owned or controlled by companies. So this includes things like fuel combustion or company vehicles, as well as unintentional leaks, as we call them, fugitive leaks, that lead to emissions leaks. The second is on scope 2, so that's purchased electricity, heat, or steam, so energy that you're purchasing but not necessarily owning or controlling. And the final, which is very often, most often, the largest category of emissions, is scope 3. So that's anything to do with emissions along your supply chain, from purchased goods or services, from business travel, waste disposal, and then transportation up and downstream of any products. And so the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which who's the originator of this idea of the scopes, they've identified sort of 15 different categories for within their Scope 3 standard. And as Matilda alluded to, there's a lot of discussion around Scope 3. You know, the fact that it represents such a large proportion of companies' emissions very often means that we need to understand it, and we need to understand it specifically with the end of knowing where the hotspots are so that we can deploy decarbonization innovations or interventions with the ultimate goal of reducing emissions along the supply chain. So if we can go to the next slide, please. The importance of addressing Scope 3 emissions is really understanding your inventory and understanding those potential intervention points. But as we mentioned, while there's really strong convergence on the fact that Scope 3 emissions must be included as part of a net zero target, there's not enough good guidance on which Scope 3 emissions should be included. And that can look differently according to different standards. So some of them say that it should be a numerical threshold. For example, 90% of your Scope 3 emissions should be measured and under some sort of target. Some say the most relevant emissions. So that's really whatever emissions reflect the inventory or emissions profile of your company most accurately. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 3 standards define 6 criteria of relevance, including your ability to influence those emissions, or the key stakeholders that are responsible for those emissions. And then the final is just most significant emissions. So by a size criterion, you just pick the Scope 3 emissions that make up the bulk of your of that portion. And so the question of how those emissions should be addressed is also sometimes a variation within the standards. If we could go to the next slide, please. So some of the challenges with Scope 3 accounting are largely this idea that because it is not necessarily within your control, because it's your value chain emissions, there can be differences in data collection or estimating and modeling emissions between yourself and your suppliers, or even just between companies, how they're getting to their different Scope 3 calculations. There can be different reporting methods for Scope 3, as well as just understanding how to quantify and verify emissions across very diverse and complex and definitely often very global supply chains. The recent tariff wars in the NAFTA area between my country, Canada, and Kaya's country, the United States, have really, really brought to light just how much international trade there is for a single product. For example, in the automotive industry, something passing between the border upwards of 10 times before being a final product. So really showing that with such a diverse and global supply chain, it can be hard to really understand where those hotspots of emissions are because there's such a large global trading network. There's also understanding who should be responsible for those Scope 3 emissions, who should take responsibility. Is it the large parent company or is it the individual supplier? Noting that, often the parent company will perhaps be the one who's supporting the financing of decarbonization solutions along the supply chain. And there can also be difference in Scope 3 reporting across jurisdiction, which, as I mentioned, with the global supply chain makes it difficult. And so this is where we come to really get to the crux of this question, which is what do we do with the hard to abate emissions, the ones that once we've identified and done all the calculations with all these obstacles in mind, what do we do with the emissions that we just don't know how to decarbonize, or we don't have the power over decarbonizing? And so we sort of then turn to these sort of market-based mechanisms in order to intervene. So I'll pass over to Kaya.
Thanks so much, Alexis. Yeah, unsurprisingly, it's challenging to implement net zero, and it's especially challenging to implement net zero the further out you get from your core business operations. But in a globalized market, we all rely on things that are built, transported, developed elsewhere, and we absolutely have a responsibility to support all of those communities and workers and organizations and companies around the world that are enabling us to make a profit. That's kind of where the rules have come down. Scope 3 is part of your responsibility. It's a shared responsibility, and we need to develop collective action responses to that. And in a world that is governed by markets, collective action responses often are kind of markets as a first port of call. But there are different market-based mechanisms out there. And I want to say, first of all, that not all the solutions to Scope 3 challenges are in markets, but some of them are. And what we have is, at the moment, a fierce debate waging where there are different types of market-based instruments that people have different opinions about. For the sake of clarity in those debates, I'm going to first just walk through different types of instruments and how they might be used differently in a net zero strategy, as well as where the kind of standards have landed on them, including open questions. So the question of whether to compensate for ongoing emissions through the purchasing and retiring of, say, a credit is, or perhaps purchasing or retiring of an emissions unit, might not be through a credit, is a long-standing debate, right? That debate goes back as far as the earliest kind of carbon crediting trading platforms, probably late 1990s. And what the kind of robust evidence of the last 20 years has showed us is that the majority of the carbon market today, avoided emissions credits, are not really stable as a form of compensation. People are not really certain enough about their emissions reductions benefits in terms of being a kind of credible net zero aligned offset that says, I'm allowed to just keep emitting and cancel out my emissions if I buy your emissions reduction. However, there is kind of a growing and definitely an area of convergence in the standards, understanding that we will need to remove a small percentage of residual emissions, particularly in hardest to abate sectors, by that net zero target date. And so translating that to the organizational level, there is an acceptance of a small portion of what we call residual emissions. And residual emissions are defined as those that are left over at the net zero target date, right, or expected to be. Those can be counterbalanced, literally physically balanced by durable removals. If you have ongoing CO2 emissions, you can draw that down and cancel that out. But that has to be kind of, in order to avoid the moral hazard of everyone just counting on that as a strategy, that has to be just sort of what you expect. IEA pathways are a good way to sort of look at what we might expect to be residual. So removal credits have been, or just removal projects have been accepted. They've been given the green light as a net zero aligned offset in line with our net zero aligned offsetting principles. Then there's a whole debate about these other types of credits. There's a huge amount of good work, even if it maybe falls short of the mark to be considered a net zero aligned offset. There's all this amazing good work going on in the high quality credits in the market. And increasingly corporates we're seeing are demanding higher quality credits. They're actually buying less cheap stuff in order to increase quality. And so there's avoided emissions credits like, protecting a forest, right? These are things that have been ruled to be not great offsets, but they make incredibly important contributions to global net zero. And there's wealth transfer from, global north often to global south with these credits. There's amazing projects that we wouldn't want to be defunded. So there's this wider recognition of a new role for those types of credits as contributions to global net zero that companies can make. And there's increasingly proposals within the standards landscape that actually we want companies to be taking some kind of financial responsibility for their annual unabated emissions. Those are the emissions that are out there kind of today and on the path to net zero, by putting a carbon price on them and either deciding to put that money back into the company to decarbonize faster, or spending that money on really high quality carbon credits that help the world get to net zero. There's a question about whether we should be either requiring that or at the minimum rewarding companies that are doing that while others are not, especially as we are figuring out the kind of long-term decarbonization technologies and options that are going to help us drive down our inventory emissions. But there's a long-standing conversation about the need to separate those out, because and the EU has ruled on this with its kind of claims legislation, that we should not be claiming that those are equivalent to meeting your reduction targets. That's confusing to consumers. That's basically like saying we've done one thing while doing another. So you need to be clear that that's what you're doing. You're contributing to global net zero while you continue on your decarbonization pathway. And then there's a third type of kind of market-based instrument that is sort of newer. It's being explored. It's kind of new to the scene. And these are what I put into the category of contract decarbonization. There are a number of Scope 3 supply chain solutions, for example, solutions to the big problems that we have, say, in cement or steel, or harder to reach and harder to decarbonize parts of a supply chain that require an injection of cash today in order for those solutions to mature tomorrow. Those can be matured through advanced market commitments that help shore up, a market and de-risk a market for investors. Those might be kind of developed and purchased in the form of commodity certificates long term. But there's an open question as to how, if a company does do those kinds of nice market stimulating activities, how the company ends up claiming about that or reporting that as part of its net zero strategy. Some people think that that should be allowed. There's certain kind of commodity certificates that you should be allowed to claim as an emissions reduction in your scope 3 if you're not able to influence your supplier directly. Others feel that this still fits into the category of a contribution because it's a wider impact, it's a wider systemic intervention. And so this ongoing debate is a fascinating one, and it's changing a little bit how we think of net zero strategies. It's clear that we know what we want companies to do. We want them to rapidly decarbonize in line with sectoral pathways that are science-based. We want them to be preparing to compensate any expected residual emissions by purchasing and supporting the development of durable removals today. We want them to contribute globally to net zero, especially if they're off track of their targets. And we also want them to help stimulate markets to through contract decarbonization. But that's a lot to ask. So how do we organize that all? One of the ways that I've been thinking about this is to sort of split it up. You look at your total emissions footprint, you estimate your residual emissions, and then you say, okay, we're reserving this much of our budget for compensation. That's going towards kind of those expensive durable removals. Probably want to set interim milestones so we don't just have to pay that, sticker price all at once at 2040 or 2050. But in the meantime, we are also taxing ourselves for the unabated emissions we have today and developing a strategic climate fund. If we can't pay that money into kind of our own systems and processes immediately to help our own company decarbonize, we are going to pay that out to the rest of the world because that represents a fair contribution. Perhaps your carbon price is something in line with the social cost of carbon. For some sectors, the social cost of carbon is going to be too high as a carbon price to kind of set on your annual unabated emissions. However, it's a good way for us to compare. If we look over at one company and we see that they have kind of taxed themselves at the social cost of carbon, but another company in a comparable sector, comparable size, has only given themselves a $10 carbon price or a $0 carbon price, then that tells us a lot about ambition. This creates at least some kind of comparability on effort that is not just whether or not they've reduced their inventory emissions, which doesn't always show the whole picture. This is a little bit more complicated to integrate the idea of a scope 3 kind of market mechanism or a scope 3. Let's say you are a company and you realize that there's a big bottleneck in your supply chain. So you put in place an advanced market commitment or you help kind of support a scope 3 solution. At the time when you have put that money in, let's say that's 2027, you're not seeing the immediate effects of that in your inventory. But maybe you claim that as a contribution and you talk about the kind of money you've spent on that and the anticipated emission reduction you might get from that in your kind of current annual reports. However, at some point, if that kind of supply chain solution matures and you can be expected to have those reductions in your value chain, there will hopefully be a jump in your value chain down to a sort of a more reasonable or more ambitious curve. That's the thinking at the moment, but at the moment, there's different questions about whether or not investments in one place can be attributable to long-term value chain reductions in another. But overall, I think what this discussion emphasizes is that not only do we need to look at net zero as a pathway down, reducing our emissions, but we also need to help reward companies and recognize their efforts in the standard system for investing in the stuff that's going to help scale up a green economy. At the moment, we've really underemphasized those kind of short-term, but also will benefit long-term systemic interventions. And so Matilda and I, along with our co-author, Claire Wigg, came up with a bit of an alternative to our kind of typical conversation around scopes, where we talk about spheres of influence. These are separate to scopes. You wouldn't be counting them necessarily in your inventory, but they are an area where we can begin to track and reward and consider companies' wider impacts. These could be the kind of innovations that they're developing in their own products. These could be the purchased credits that wouldn't make traditional offsets. These could be those advanced market commitments I was talking about, or they could be the political and policy advocacy that companies are going to need to do to help unstick block points in their transition plans. If you want to read more about our ideas around spheres of influence and rewarding wider systemic interventions, you can go to our paper that's been published in the Journal of Carbon Management, or our HBR article that does a quick summary.
Amazing. Thank you, Kaya. And I think one of the themes that's sort of been running through both what Kaya's presented and Alexis is this idea of equity, and equity with regards to what different responsibilities different organizations have, but also what we've not heard about yet is kind of equity and justice in relation to people, because climate is about people. It's getting to net zero is around how we affect people's livelihoods, the economies and communities and nature that they're living in. So I think it's really important that we kind of recenter this as part of our conversations. And so before I sort of dive into some of the thinking that we've been doing around this, I just wanted to sort of disaggregate between different kinds of like justice and equity thinking that you might have heard out there. And so the just transition is a term that's often talked about as sort of just transition to net zero. And that often is quite sort of thinking very much in terms of like transitioning the economy itself. It thinks about what happens to people who perhaps work in very high polluting sectors, like how are they reskilled and sort of supported to move into lower carbon alternatives. But there's also a sort of more systems-wide way of thinking about this called climate justice, which is where we kind of lead in. And so this is thinking more deeply about the sort of accountability and responsibility that different actors and in different geographies across different sectors have towards reducing carbon emissions, but also getting us to net zero, and also the ways in which different groups come to be affected by that. And it also kind of starts to think about them within their kind of like historical context. So, you know, in areas that have experienced a lot of sort of extractive economies or have histories of colonization or being colonized, how does this new way forward affect them, and how can we sort of help to sort of remedy past injustices to lift everybody up as we go along? And then the other term that you might have heard about is environmental justice. And that takes the same kind of like systemic view as climate justice, but climate is just one element of environmental justice. So environmental justice would also incorporate things like water or air pollution or noise pollution, things like that. And so when we're thinking about climate justice, there's sort of three key sort of principles, let's say, that underpin how we're thinking about it. The first is the procedural. So that's how people are involved in deciding in the direction that we should be taking towards net zero. And when I say we, that means both governments, but also organizations. How are organizations thinking about integrating the voices of people who are affected by their transition plans into how those transition plans are designed? The next one is distributive. So how the benefits and costs of the net zero transition are distributed between different communities and across different landscapes, spaces, geographies, sectors, and different organizations. So let's say within the value chain, SMEs versus larger companies, what's the effect on them? And the last one is reparative, and that sort of speaks to more the trying to undo historical wrongs, or at least not perpetuate them and make them worse. So how are the sort of the transformations that we're thinking about helping to improve the lot of people who have typically been exploited by the sort of capitalist extractivist systems which got us into this mess in the first place? And so there's kind of two key areas where we've been thinking about this. First is within the sort of the organization within the context of global net zero, which Kaya has spoken about quite a lot. So what responsibility the organization has to the sort of the whole beyond its own boundary. And the second is the sort of practices and processes that an organization uses to meet its net zero target. And there's kind of different ways in which to split this. So you might have heard about the term common but differentiated responsibility. That doesn't really apply to organization, but it basically speaks to this idea that some actors have greater responsibility for reducing emissions based on the amount of carbon that they've put into the atmosphere historically than others. And amongst organizations, this is usually sort of termed like fair share. And this is some language we're starting to see a lot more of in the standards landscape. And this kind of speaks to the rates at which different organizations should be transitioning to net zero. If you imagine it as a kind of sliding scale, are there some that should be doing more now? Are there others that we could say, okay, actually, maybe you think about this in a few years' time to prepare yourself, given your capacities or your sector or the geography within which you're based. There's a lot of debate around how one kind of cuts that cake and the trade-offs that when you do that. And the last one, which speaks to the work Kaya was talking about, was the contributions that organizations can make to some of the climate solutions, but also some of the systematic interventions that can get us to net zero as a global community. So through some of their contributions and compensation work. And then within organizations themselves, in the net zero standards, when we did our mapping last year, we found that just over 50% of the standards said that organizations need to think about how justice and equity are integrated. But what does that actually mean? There's a lot of different ways to think about that. It's both how workers are affected, so in terms of reskilling, in terms of where they might have to move for different to sort of take part in the job differently or whatever, but also how you engage, for example, with trade unions, how you engage with your supply chain, how your organization itself is structured and skilled to be able to take on some of the requirements of a just transition. Is there organizational responsibility all the way up to the top for the just transition to be embedded within net zero? And so that's what we've been doing over the last couple of months. We started a project back in October, and we've got our objective basically was to fill that gap. What should organizations be doing within their sort of organizational boundaries to get to a just net zero transition? And so we're working with 12 youth from 11 countries around the world to co-produce some guidance that we really want to sort of land within the standard space that unpacks the kind of engagement that's needed with affected communities, who affected communities are, the kind of monitoring, evaluation and reporting on those different metrics. And what we're trying to do here basically is really just give the how to organizations and provide a bit more standardized guidance as to the sort of what is best practice as organizations are starting to think about this. And I think we are.
Great. Thanks so much, Matilda. Just a reminder that we've got some great questions coming in. We'll close in a minute or two just to have time for your questions. If you see a question that you would really like answered, please upvote it so that we can get to it first, and then we'll work our way through the list. So next slide, please. So 2025, this year and next year are pivotal years in the standards landscape. We have the ISO net zero standard, the first international standard on net zero, which is being developed. Kaya is hard at work on that, as well as our colleagues in the standards landscape at the moment, and that will be launched later this year. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the most widely used protocol for measuring and reporting emissions, is being updated for the first time in 20 years. And the public draft will be available of that next summer. So I sit on the technical working group for the corporate standard revision, and we're going through that process at the moment. And then SBTi, they're also going through their revision, and the public consultation for that standard opens in March of this year. So lots of potentials for public consultation for these documents and for getting involved in these processes. And it's really important that we hear a wide diversity of voices in these spaces. Next slide, please. And just a quick kind of overview of some work that we are working on at the moment with the business school is taking the knowledge that we have on translating net zero from policy to practice and from scientific principle to policy and practice, and making sure that that knowledge is available to folks outside of our research group. So we run the Oxford Sustainable Business Programme jointly with the business school that is running this year from the 15th of September, the week of the 15th of September, and applications are now open for that. We had our first cohort in October last year, an incredible cohort of change makers. So we walked through the science and the standards and the strategy of getting your firm to net zero. So if you're interested in that course, you'd be most welcome to apply.
In addition to that work, where we have an opportunity to engage business leaders, we are also working with a select group of businesses to develop out methodologies and reporting and thinking around how they can highlight their influence across the various spheres of influence. So if there are companies that are just really leading on policy engagement to unstick areas of their transition plan, we want to hear from them. If there are companies that are really leading on driving global contributions to net zero through market-based mechanisms or other forms of financing and collective action, we want to hear from them. And we are also working with companies who are really driving forward the frontier of product innovation to drive emissions down in society to help consumers avoid emissions, because companies dictate so much about our day-to-day lives, and that helps us drive the sustainability transition more broadly than simply your operational inventory. So this is exciting research and work that we're doing, focus groups, and if you know of any articles or frameworks, or if you're kind of if you're part of an advisory service that's working with companies on similar topics about systemic climate impact, we'd love to connect.
Great, thanks so much, Kaya. And just a reminder, as we said, this is part of the wider seminar series, so you'd be very welcome to join us for the next week and following. So with that, we'll turn to the Q&A. We have our first question from Bard Humray. He says, the Scope 3 emission creates a lot of debate. Your colleague, Professor Ramana at Oxford, states that, quote, only emissions entering the atmosphere are direct emissions, end quote. In other words, just Scope 1. What is your view, and why all of the discussion on Scope 3 emissions?
I love this question, and one of the things I love about working at Oxford is the opportunity to have healthy disagreement with our peers. The claim that Scope 3 emissions I think should be eradicated, I think that is Karthik's view, leaves so much power and collective opportunity on the table. The theory of Scope 3 is that we have to work together, and we're absolutely not going to make it to net zero unless we do. The innovation I'm seeing in the net zero landscape with these common initiatives to help drive sectoral change would never have happened if companies hadn't taken responsibility for their Scope 3 emissions. Not to mention that a company should not just be from an equity perspective. I'm a company headquartered in the global north. I have huge market capital, but I'm only expected to take responsibility for my emissions that happen on my site. What is that saying from a global equity perspective? That we're just going to let the kind of communities and companies that are least responsible for climate change historically, we're going to tax them and make them deal with those emissions without kind of taking some responsibility to help and support them. That is not a theory of global net zero that I can subscribe to. It's an isolationist view of responsibility, and it's not one that will ultimately be successful to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Now, what Karthik is proposing is that we put a kind of I don't know, like a scanner on each product, and then the individual ultimately ends up paying for the emissions that they're buying. Shifting responsibility to consumers, to individuals, either upstream or downstream, those developing or those kind of buying at the end, is just a way of splitting up that responsibility rather than working together and thinking more systemically. It might perhaps work at a high level on a border carbon adjustment mechanism, but it's definitely not working within the accountability system that we've developed, the corporate accountability system that we've developed, where we have corporations developing holistic systemic strategies and working with other corporations to achieve those targets. So I would say that there are some perhaps aspects of Karthik's proposal that could be complementary, but I'd point you to, from an accounting perspective, Michael Gillenwater's excellent paper on the e-liability framework and why it is not in some ways complementary to the GHG system that we've already built and have to keep building on in order to not lose time.
Thanks so much, Kaya, and I'll put Michael's paper into the chat as well so people can read up on that. And the next question is from Anthony Bridgen. Given the huge environmental impact of generative AI models in terms of electricity, water, and materials, are there any standards being developed around this, both in terms of developing these models, Scope 2, and using them, Scope 3?
Do you want me to take that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because we actually have not done that much work on generative AI. I don't know if there are colleagues at Oxford who are looking at standards in the generative AI space at present. It's not a focus area of ours.
Yeah, there is, I think, some work being done I mean, well, the companies that are like Google and Meta and those companies, like actually Google just put out its methodology for how it's establishing its AI. I'm happy to see if that's public and put that in the chat. This is a huge issue. I think I heard recently that the increased demand from AI in one state where there were new servers was the amount of an entire state's electricity grid. So we really can't take this lightly. And it's one of the reasons that I think some of the tech companies in particular are having to rethink their net zero strategies in terms of their system impacts. They're going to have to really engage in the system to develop low carbon energy if they are going to continue with the AI expansion. I am, however, of course, really heartened by the development of more efficient AI systems and AI models. Hopefully the race to efficiency can help us out there. But I will put a post on the Google methodology in the chat. And I think there was also just last week a global AI meeting about risks in AI, kind of like the first COP, but for AI. My friend was there and he was a little disappointed, but happy to post about that in case anyone wants to read up on the outcomes of that discussion.
Thanks, Kaya. I'm just going to jump one question below one of the upvoted ones, and then we'll come back to your question, Cesar. So Paul says, thank you for another fascinating session. Thank you, Paul. Could you please say a bit more about the term hard to abate? It feels unhelpful to a change agenda in a world which is trying to deliver net zero. So I might take it first and then pass it on to Matilda and Kaya. And the interesting thing about hard to abate, which is sort of what we term as residual emissions, everything that's left over, is we've been trying to make sure that the criteria for defining what residual is very clear. So there are certain emissions that will be hard to abate, but the question is, how are we defining hard? Is it technical infeasibility? Is it financial infeasibility? Is it logistical infeasibility? And so trying to make sure that we're really narrowing that down to just the logistical infeasibility rather than financial or political feasibility, for example. Kaya, I think, has something to say about the feasibility thing, so maybe I'll let her come in there.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it comes down to, in terms of residual emissions, it comes down to your pathway. So the standards can only be so prescriptive. They have to sort of look at how a company is setting its pathway in line with the science. And typically people sort of look to IEA as like a benchmark, but regionally specific and more sectorally specific pathway and modeling is needed. And so what an auditor might look for is how kind of off like other companies in the sector or other companies in the sector in the region is your pathway, and then how much is your estimated residual emissions based on that pathway. If you're, if you're say in a like the utility sector, which is expected to be, I don't know, maybe only 3 or 4% residual emissions according to the IEA, but you've estimated that your residual emissions is going to be something like 20%. at 2050, then an auditor would look at that and say, that doesn't seem in line with what your sector is supposed to do for us to meet global net zero. Now, do you have some kind of extenuating circumstance? Are you in a market where it's really, really difficult and there's still a lot of reliance on kind of high carbon technologies? Are you in a part of a developing world that needs a little more time from a fair share perspective? Then the auditor would take those things into account and see if there can be an adjustment made.
Great, thanks so much, Kaya. So coming back to Cesar's question, what is the difference in the impact towards real net zero of having a discussion if Scope 3 actions are classified as contract decarbonization or contribution?
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah. So what is the difference in the impact towards real net zero? Let's say I'll just remove that. If Scope 3 actions are classified as contract decarbonization or contribution.
As with any question like that in the standards landscape, it's kind of like a dominoes thing. Like if you pull one string over here, it affects another part of a standard over here. So let's talk about what we want companies to do. We want them to do a huge amount of effort prioritizing their own emissions reductions, right? But we also want them, when they're stuck, to be able to invest in things that help change the system and then can ultimately become, inventory reductions for them, but long term. So right now, the standards landscape is not really sufficiently rewarding or even guiding companies to do that second part. The question, however, is, and there's this moral trade-off question, if we allow them to claim that as an interim reduction, will they stop doing the work, over on the left side of the inventory, which is their kind of like bread and butter? Will they stop doing the efficiency measures that we need them to do inside their own operations? And so there's a couple ways to think about this. We can lower the amount of Scope 3 that companies are setting like a physical target around, like an inventory target around. We can say that only some Scope 3 emissions can companies reasonably be expected to engage their supplier on. But there's other Scope 3 emissions that we want them to set interventions on. So you end up with kind of two targets, like two ledgers. One is the typical inventory attributional reduction ledger, and the other is an intervention ledger where we're like, look, we've established that they can't reasonably influence a lot of their suppliers here, so they're taking a systemic approach. Or perhaps you keep it all together and you just allow them to set targets in a different way at the target level. These are the discussions going on in the standards landscape. And I guess my feeling is that I hope we get to the right solution that helps companies take action on both sides of the ledger and be clear about what they're doing and not mislead the public on what they're doing. Apart from that, I can't tell you how we're going to get there. And people have wildly different views on this.
Great, thanks so much, Kaya. I'll come down actually to Leah's question. I'm interested in the social impacts of just energy transitions, particularly on regional health inequalities. However, it appears there's a lack of research on the social policy implications and the role of social policies to support a just transition. Do you know of any research or useful resources in this space? Matilda, do you know of any?
I'm just thinking about specifically health related. That is a bit of yeah. Nothing is immediately coming to mind on that. Have you encountered any research around health inequalities?
So there's a little bit on energy transitions impacting sort of development outcomes. There's quite a bit on, so for example, land grabs for solar interventions. There's some research there. I can put some links in the chat for in China and in India and in the United States as well, of areas that have been sort of cleared off where people's land rights have been compromised in the interest of clean energy. And so, yeah, happy to put some work in there. And but that's very much, that would be health, one step removed, health inequalities as a result of development outcomes rather than looking specifically at health inequalities. But I'll pull through, there's some researchers doing work on just energy transitions and development outcomes, and I'll put some links in the chat so you can hopefully go from there. Great, thanks so much for the question, Leah. And we'll get some resources over to you. Then Bill, we have a question. What, in your view, is the impact on this standard setting process of the US government pulling out of involvement in these bodies, as well as most US-based financial institutions withdrawing from these groups? Kai, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I like to build a net zero governance system for the next 10 and 20 years. And we have to just keep our heads down and keep building that architecture. I was almost tempted to write a piece. Maybe I'll still write it. All the things Trump can't touch. There are, and I'm going to shout out to our sister team at the Oxford Net Zero Policy and Regulation Hub that has just put out a report showing the advancement in net zero policy across procurement, transition plans, mandatory disclosure, and we're looking at mapping more indicators beyond that. And there are countries all around the world developing net zero regulation and policy at a fast pace that have nothing to do with the US, but will have cross-jurisdictional effects on US headquartered companies. So any company that says I'm off the hook or that is worried about, frankly, understandably worried about the backlash from Republicans on this for just doing the right thing, can keep doing the right thing. Maybe they do it less loudly, but they know they're going to be regulated by other companies all around the world, whether that be Japan or Brazil or the EU, right? There are companies all around the world that are having to comply increasingly to net zero standards, and those are being put into regulation. So I guess my answer is I think we're going to see companies using different language, talking about the business case more for sustainability. They're probably going to talk less about sustainability and less buzzwords, but they also have had to make this case for the last 10 years to even get as far as we have on net zero. They know that we'll save trillions across the economy by going faster on net zero. And so they'll probably just do it under a different name if they're good companies. And then the ones that never really meant it and never really brought those into their business models probably will back off. And then we'll see them get caught up in the regulation in a few years. But my message to everyone is keep your head down, keep building the architecture that you're going to build, maybe be smart about how you communicate it. But the US, I'm the first to say the US isn't everything and we aren't everywhere. So keep going.
Yeah, I agree. That's great. Yeah, I would also say, and sorry, Leah, I've just put a bunch of links in the chat for some energy justice and decolonizing, green colonialism stuff that might be relevant, again, in a roundabout way to health inequalities. But it would be great to see some emergent research there. So if folks are interested in that, Benjamin Sobukul has done some research on that, and I've put some other links in the chat too. I would say as well, I feel like there's a lot of US centrism, which makes sense due to their power, but also a reminder that when Trump first pulled out of the Paris Agreement, it also led to quite a big swell in non-state actors stepping up and saying, we're still in. There's been states coming in and stepping in and say, we still want to be held to the principles of the Paris Agreement, even if we aren't at the federal level. The financial institutions who are pulling out of those standards agreement, of those sort of standard spaces, it's not only a political decision, influenced by who's in power. It's also there are lots of other reinforcing factors of what makes companies make environmentally responsible or not decisions, and that includes, for example, public pressure. And so there's not only one lever, and politicians are not the only lever for influence on companies' outcomes. So. Yeah, while decentering the US as much as we can, that's also something to bear in mind.
I wouldn't go that far now. America's still in, right? Go California.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for your questions and for being really engaged in the webinar. It's really lovely to hear from so many of you. You can follow our work at netzeroclimate.org. I'll actually, if I can get it in time, we have a little page that's dedicated specifically to the engagement and impact team, where you can learn a little bit more about our work specifically on standards and sort of the other areas of work that we do, which we didn't really speak about that much today. But feel free to follow our work and stay in touch for the seminar series, and enjoy the rest of your day.